So, Randy, what an honor it is to have the opportunity to talk to you. Your work has influenced me personally pretty much since I moved out to the Bay Area close to 20 years ago. So I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to learn what's exciting you these days and how you're thinking about the future. And it's wonderful for this audience to hear you at the Pioneer Summit. The summit is, of course, focused on the future, and you have a tremendous history here in the past at Silicon Valley. You've been an entrepreneur, you've been a corporate innovator, you've been senior in-house counsel, you've been a founder, educator, mentor, advisor, and most recently, investor. So as you think about the future, thinking about all that you've learned in the past, what are some of the technologies that are exciting you most these days?
Yeah, it's an interesting way to phrase it, because I'm actually not an investor who gets excited by technologies. I get excited by problems, and I get excited by the application of new technology and innovation to solving those problems. So while there's clearly very interesting technologies, and you may know more about the emerging technologies than I do in many regards, I think that what's interesting really is the application of those to what I consider to be some of the biggest challenges facing our society and culture in certainly the last several hundred years. Whether it's dealing with issues like food and nutrition on a global basis, or whether it's dealing with education and the opportunity to unleash human potential. Obviously, climate change, we hear about it all the time, and energy, it's kind of corollary in the world, but pandemics and healthcare. And we're at cutting edge innovation in all of those areas. But frankly, technology doesn't excite me. It is the application of those to doing things that matter. You know, it's interesting because a lot of people think about Steve Jobs, for instance, as an incredible innovator. I think about him as somebody who never shipped a technology before its time. Meaning that he's somebody who had the foresight not to ship early technologies that didn't have the cost potential or the feature or service potential that could deliver the experience he wanted to deliver. And whenever he delivered a product, you knew that the technologies had converged in terms of a cost-effective way to deliver the experience that he wanted. And that's really what my job is to find that convergence of technologies, problems, and the appropriate timing to bring them to the market to make a difference.
That's such a great point, and we really heard a lot about that this morning, that it's really not just about the technology, that it's about how you apply that technology to solve a real problem and the understanding of a real problem. And I'd imagine you've worked with hundreds of entrepreneurs over your years. What makes for a great problem finder? I mean, what are some of the skills that you've seen of entrepreneurs and innovators that are really able to see the bigger picture and not fall in love with their technology?
You know, I think there are lots of different definitions of what makes a great entrepreneur. My definition of great entrepreneur is somebody who is passionate enough about the goal, the objective, that they're willing to fail. And that's because most innovation fails. By its nature, by definition, most innovation will fail. And finding those people who are so passionate and tenacious around their vision for a better future, that they're willing to bet everything on accomplishing that and commit themselves and dedicate themselves to that in a way that allows them at least a good or better chance of accomplishing them. That's my job, is finding those people. You know, in my business, there's lots of ways to invest. It's very popular now to chase trends. And that actually be an effective way for an investor to make money. But it doesn't interest me because it doesn't add value. I see if I'm not adding value to the innovation cycle, I might as well be doing something else. And so my job is to identify great entrepreneurs and empower them. That's really my job. I'm in the human potential business, both in terms of the entrepreneurs I work with as well as the customers and the impact that they have. So what I look for are people who can envision a future probably that I can't. I mean, I sit down every day, and rather than having a thesis about the future saying it is clean energy, or it is pandemics, or it is games, I sit around and open my door every day to numerous lunatics who come in and explain to me a future, sort of a delusion that doesn't exist today, that is very unlikely, and I try to find the ones to fall in love with. the people and the ideas to fall in love with. And so I don't go in with a strong filter about what I think the future is. If I had that filter when I was an entrepreneur, if I were to apply that filter now, I would most likely be selling short the opportunities that get to walk through my door every day. And that's really the greatest thing about being a Kleiner Perkins, is the people who will come and talk to me. And so I get to pick a lunatic every couple of months to share the journey with. And it's a fun life.
So is this when we do that quick show of hands to see how many lunatics
Yeah.
there are in the office, right? This is really a conference of lunatics. We got a two-handed lunatic up here.
Big lunatic.
But I think that's fantastic. A couple of things in that. One is knowing what your job is, right? That your job is not necessarily to predict the technology, but your job is to bet on the right lunatic, the best visionary. And at the same time, I think one of the things we've seen in the last 5 years is this emergence of a discipline around entrepreneurship. And I think your book, Getting to Plan B, was one of the first to really put out there a codified process, a systemic process that said your first idea needs a whole lot of hypothesis testing, iteration, evidence gathering against a point of view in a visual dashboard. You know, you really talk succinctly about clarifying your leap of faith assumptions and really understanding your business model. So I think it's interesting to have that both creative vision as well as the discipline behind that. So I really give you a lot of credit. What are you seeing in terms of that discipline play out?
So Getting to Plan B was an interesting project for me. It is as close to a business book as I ever want to write. I'm not somebody who really likes business books. I find them to be too prescriptive. They're historical. They look backwards. They don't look forwards. You know, if you read the first chapter and the last chapter of a business book, you pretty much got the whole thing. The other 300 pages is useless. So Getting to Plan B was my first foray into writing what I think was a more conventional business book. And the reason I wrote it was that my co-author, John Mullins, who I have deep respect for, teaches at the London School of Business, he had come to Stanford to spend a sabbatical teaching and researching a book. And he approached me with his thesis for a book, which was he wanted to find the model, the path by which you're able to take early business plans and trace them to business success so that he could begin to sort out which were the most successful methods for doing that. And frankly, from the moment he walked in my office, I just disagreed with him. I said, that's not the way that I've seen great businesses develop over the course of my career. And to John's credit, rather than simply walking out and writing the book he wanted to write, he engaged me in a debate, which became a collaboration, which became a book. And the book really marries these two concepts of the discipline of being able to develop an idea and the jettisoning of the concept of the plan. And the basic premise of the book is that if you come into my office with a business plan that maps out your revenues, gross margin, operating expenses, and profits, capital needs for the next 5 years, something that almost every venture capitalist will ask you to do, and you do that before you have a product, before you maybe have an employee, certainly before you have a customer or a dollar of revenue. If you are right, you are lucky, not smart. And you can't be smart. You don't have enough data to be smart. And I don't invest in luck. So the problem is that there's got to be, if the business plan is fundamentally flawed from the time it walks into my office, why do we spend so much time on it? Why do boards of directors spend so much time trying to force the team post-investment to execute against it? Why do we measure success against it? And I think it's an artifact of a different type of investing that was probably much more prominent in large companies and even Silicon Valley some 25 years ago. And my sense is that if you take out the business plan, if you agree with my premise, and any of you have tried to put together a business plan to go pitch a venture capitalist before you have a product, probably have sat down and thought about how silly and foolish this process seems. But if you agree with that, then what do we substitute for it? We can't simply have mayhem. There's got to be some discipline and rigor in the process. And so the process becomes one of what I call, essentially benchmarking against leaps of faith and driving metrics against testing ideas and assumptions. It's the early creative process of building a business is about testing ideas and assumptions. First, you identify them. Then you figure out the cheapest and simplest way to test them. Now, the simplest and cheapest way to test them is look at history. Who has come before you who has either failed or succeeded with this idea? Most entrepreneurs, particularly young ones who come to my office, have no sense of history. None. They haven't even been curious about it. The idea is that they've come in with an idea that they think is radical, revolutionary, changes the world, and I look at this idea and I think about 20 different analogs that are out there. And why this is different, why this is the same, why this is the right moment, and maybe the last time it failed, it was the wrong moment. But that's how my mind works. But what I find with entrepreneurs most often is they ignore that. They think about their idea as somehow a eureka moment, and it is absolutely unique, which, by the way, I haven't seen a unique idea in all of my years looking at new ideas. It is revolutionary, and if I hear that term again, I will pull my hair out. And so my sense is when I spend time with these people, I want them to identify their core assumptions to their idea. I want them to tell me why it is different than the ones that have failed in the past or succeeded. And I want them to show me a breadth of understanding of how their product relates to the past that goes beyond the literalness of their product. For instance, if you're looking at if you're thinking about investing in the iPod in the early 2000s, you would clearly look at the Sony Walkman for some analogs and analogs about this. Not the technology, but about the customer base and the user. It's that simple. So what I do is have them go through analog and analogs, identify those for me, show me their core assumptions, resolve the ones that I can through history, and then identify what I call the leaps of faith, the things that are absolutely unique to them today. And a lot of that can be a differentiation from the analog and analogs that have existed historically, but leaps of faith are where the process of dashboarding begins, which is identify your assumptions, come up with metrics for measuring the validity of those assumptions, and test them as quickly as you can. And this is the 20/80 issue, right? I mean, you're going to have to test them 20% and then use your judgment to come up with the 80% potential, because if you spend the time and money to test them at 80%, you will run out of time and money before you get to your answer. So this is an iterative process. You identify these things, you resolve them, you come up with new ones. And what's interesting, and John and I having worked through this at length, what was really interesting was we realized that at some point, as your business becomes highly operational, what do you have? A business plan. You have a business plan that's driven empirically, not by assumption. And you begin to focus on the things that we think about as natural in a business plan. Revenues, why? It's a measure of market demand. Gross margin, why? It's a measure of unit economics. Operating expenses, why? It's a measure of scale. And so these become key leaps of faith later in the process when you have empirical information. So that's how we end up writing the book. That's how we decided to apply a discipline to what we thought is otherwise a relatively random creative process. And I think what's really particularly interesting is the thing that I got from writing that book was it taught me a little bit about what I really look for in an entrepreneur. Because, everybody says people are special, I look for great people. And I have focused my attention on choosing great entrepreneurs through my entire career because it's all I know. I don't know technology as well as I know people. But what this book taught me was what I really wanted in an entrepreneur, in addition to that passion, in addition to the tenacity, was I wanted somebody who could learn on the job. I wanted somebody who was committed enough to their ultimate goals to be tenacious enough to persist, but who were open-minded enough about the path to get there, to be able to take in new information and steer around the obstacles. And so that helped me actually writing the book, and I have become clear about the lunatics I invest in.
Well, I think the point that you're really alluding to is this notion that we need to balance the creative thinking and the critical thinking and that when we choose to invest in one, either the creative side or critical side, depends on where you are and depends on what you need in the process to move it forward. And one of the things I really liked about that book is that the whole notion of finding analogs, particularly when you think you're bringing something new to the market, is itself a creative process.
Yes.
We tend to think of creativity around the idea itself, not the analysis around the idea.
Yes.
And I think that's a really important part to understand how to apply your creative discipline to a critical aspect of moving your idea forward.
Yes, yes, I think that's right. You know, when I worked for George Lucas, there are obviously many things I learned from him, but one thing that always stuck with me is he once sort of said, you know, it's much easier to create on a canvas that has 3 random dots on it than it is a completely white canvas.
Yes.
And the idea that creativity gets hinged to some sort of metric and analysis is really important, because that's when you can really unleash your creativity.
I couldn't agree more, and a lot to unpack there that we won't have time for, but I've been teaching innovation to executives and MBA students, and now at Singularity for over 10 years, and one of the first things we do is practice visual thinking, because I think when we're limited to just words and the things we write, we end up with artifacts called business plans.
Yes.
But when we allow ourselves to communicate our ideas in different kinds of form, I'm not talking about fancy pictures, but a dashboard or the easiest way to get the idea across, to get feedback, to get that empirical evidence that you're looking for, it allows us to advance our ideas faster.
Yes.
So I think we're in an exciting time where some new tools are coming up to allow you to get from that blank slate more quickly in order to gather the data so that you can then move forward.
Yes,
so
yes.
Exciting.
And I do think it's really important for everybody around the table in that situation to understand what the journey is, because the journey is one of trial and error, not one of precision, surgical precision and execution. And you need to understand that in the creative process, trial and error is really important. And failure doesn't occur until you stop trying. The idea that you have tried something that turns out to be different than you assumed does not mean you failed, if you can use that information to actually improve. It's a failure when you stop and turn your back on it. Now, there may be a time when it's appropriate to stop, but it is, I think the definition of failure is really important in the creative process. Failure is not a wrong assumption. Failure is the inability to actually react to that information with a new set of tools and assumptions.
Wonderful. I love that. Failure is when you stop trying. It's a wonderful new definition. So we don't have that much time left, and I would be so remiss if I didn't bring up your first book, The Monk and the Riddle, which came out in 2000. I just moved to the Bay Area, joined my first startup, thought I was going to retire at 25. It was a very exciting time, and things didn't turn out to be that way. A very painful process for many of us. And then I stumbled upon this book called The Monk and the Riddle, which gave me very urgent and new perspective on how to think about my life and choices. And it was really almost religion at that time. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the experience of writing Monk and the Riddle, and here we are 16 years later, what's its relevance to today's time?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just talking to the editor I worked on with that book yesterday, because I'm working on another book at the moment with a good friend of mine, and and she had sent me a note. The book was just chosen as one of the top 100 business books of all time, again in 2016. So every 10 years they choose the top 100 business books. It was chosen in 2006. It was chosen again in 2016. And she sent me a note saying how magical that the moment was of doing that book. And it was truly magical, because I had no intention of doing a book. I was not a writer. Frankly, as I told you, I don't like business books. And I didn't really have the... I didn't assume that I had something really important to say. What happened was that I was involved in a number of case studies at Harvard, and the people who write the case studies sit with the people who edit the books. And so they had been conversing one day, and an editor came out to meet me at the Conditorei, which was my office, a coffee shop in Portola Valley, and said to me, boy, you've done this interesting stuff, maybe you could write a book. Frankly, I left that meeting and told her I wasn't going. I had nothing to write. I didn't like business books, and so I wasn't a good contender for this. I thought about that night, and I realized this was by the way 1998. I thought about that night and said, "Geez, nobody's going to ask me to write a book again in my life. I better walk through this door." So I called her up the next day and I said, okay, here's the deal. I'll write a book. It's going to be a book about nothing. Now, this was the time of Seinfeld, so you could actually say that. And I said, it's going to be a book about nothing. And the reason it's going to be a book about nothing is everybody writes these books about these amazing, epic successes in the business world. And, but that's not how it works. It's a grind. You go to work every day. You work really hard. If you have down days, you have up days. And if you're lucky, in the end, you succeed. Lucky, in the end, you succeed. And I said, and it's not going to be a business book, because I don't like business books. So it's got to be a narrative of some sort. And it's going to be about the heart and soul of entrepreneurship. It's not going to be about the how of entrepreneurship. And to her credit, I mean, you could tell, there's nothing coming back on the other side of the phone, right? Nothing. Dead silence. You can tell she's stunned, but she's game. She's figuring, I will get religion in this process, so let's start the process. So we start the process. But I don't get religion. And the book gets weirder and weirder in the sense that it becomes this parable, and I'm kind of a character in it. And I'm a character in it, frankly, because I needed somebody to diss in the book. And I refused to diss anybody else. So basically, when I had to point to problems, I had to point to my problems, which carried the book a long way. And so we wrote the book. Now, what's very interesting about that is I was not a writer. She got me a coach, my virtual author, wonderful guy, Kent Lineback. I learned a ton from him. Turns out in the end, of course, I touched every word in that book multiple times. I rewrote that book 6 times in 30 days, start to finish at the end. And the only reason I knew it was over is because Hollis said, stop, right? Otherwise, I'd still be writing that book. But what was interesting about writing the book was we wrote a chapter, and I liked it. I liked the beginning chapter. It was kind of fun. It's kind of cool. It takes place in a conditorei, kind of interesting characters. The ambiance is cool. Then we wrote a second chapter. It wasn't quite as good as the first one. Then we wrote a third chapter, and it sucked. But I was fine because we didn't have a pub date, and Harvard does peer review, which means they won't publish a book until it's been reviewed by a whole bunch of other authors and academics who say this is a book worthy of publishing. So I'm fine. She calls me up one day and says, it's been approved. You have a pub date. And I said, that can't possibly be. I've got 3 chapters. The last one sucks. The one before that is okay. And the first one's good, but you can see it's going the wrong direction. And second of all, how can this be peer reviewed? There's nothing there. She said, I just had the first chapter peer reviewed. So suddenly I am writing for my life. And I don't know how to write. I learned how to write. And that book really takes place on 3 levels. That book is about the heart and soul of entrepreneurship. And there's a lot of lessons about how to work as an entrepreneur and work with venture capital and all of that other stuff. It's a book about what it takes to be a great entrepreneur. But it's a Buddhist book. I'm a Buddhist practitioner. I'm a Zen practitioner and have been for 21 years now. Never missed a day of meditation. And that book was a way for me to talk about the real meaning and purpose in what we do in a reflective way. And there are people who read it at all levels. I get fan mail still today all the time. The book is still a very incredibly good seller. It actually went through a resurgence. There was a period of time when the stories in the book seemed old and people, sort of mid-2000s, and it wasn't selling as well. And then suddenly, it became classic. I mean, nobody cared that the stories were old because there was meaning in the stories. And so, but there are people who get it at every level. But for me, this was a book about the meaning and purpose of life as expressed in creativity and the practice and profession of entrepreneurship.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I love on the back of the book in 2000, USA calls it a timely read. So still timely. Randy, we are out of time, but thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for doing
this. And really just sharing all your wisdom with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.